So read, 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 stuck on the block, read, read, sitting in the box, read, read. What's going on, people? This week's great read. I didn't quite get the slap right on the table there, did I? It was kind of a fobby slap, like didn't have the right connection. There we go, I feel better now. This week's great read is the classic by Paul Gilroy, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. Very, very controversial book when it was first published. Seems canon now, like even, you know, mildly bigoted people would read this and have to say there was some common sense in it. But at the time, you know, as one of my good friends who's a professor, a black professor, tells me, at the time, people even on the left would, so-called, would take pride in excluding Mr. Gilroy from certain spaces and preventing him from getting jobs within the academy because of what he said in here. And like I said, in retrospect, what he said in here is really, you know, not even a particularly brutal critique of the way that race has influenced class politics in Britain, in the way that race and class have interacted as forces within post-war British society. And, you know, he goes through the Immigration Acts, you know, so 1968, 62, 81, Immigration Acts, through the whole kind of formation of a black working class British identity. Not that that identity is necessarily recognised within the mainstream. And just looks at the way in which power has been administered in Britain through a class-based and racial lens and interacts in those forces. He reminds us, for example, on page 47, it has been revealed that at the suggestion of Churchill, a Conservative cabinet discussed the possibility of using Keep Britain White as an electoral slogan as early as 1955. Yeah? So traditionally, the public has been blamed for the Keep Britain White campaign that hit the streets in the late 50s and early 60s. But the ruling class had already toyed with that ideology and as they were to later show with their Immigration Acts, considered biology and nation to be one, race and nation to be one, though obviously in a post-war world, in a post-Nazi world, you couldn't openly say that. And that has really been one of the big challenges of post-war Britain, at least for the ruling class, and then for the rest of us in society who don't quite get what's going on, is how to administer a racial hierarchy without making or using overtly racist language. And that's what this book sort of looks at in many, many ways. But it's, you know, a great look at the traditions of resistance as well, and the ways in which these things have been remembered. So there were lots of, as many of you who were alive in the 80s will know, those of you who are not, there were a lot of riots or quote-unquote uprisings in the 1980s in different African Caribbean neighborhoods within the country, and South Asian neighborhoods in particular, that became multicultural rebellions after the fact also, even though they've been characterized as specifically quote-unquote black. But what's interesting is the way in which they were remembered at the time. See, now most academics would look back and say, yeah, actually there were, you know, viable concerns that were expressed in this rage, even if we disagree with the rage itself. But it's important to remember, as Mr. Gilroy points out, the riots during the summer of 1981 and the autumn of 1985 were described by the left as, quote, barbarous acts of criminality and symptoms of the absence of any viable tradition of ethnic politics, close quote. While the right argued that they were a, quote, cry for loot rather than a cry for help, close quote. I remind you that the 1981 disturbances were set off by Swamp 1981 and the Sus laws, which everyone looks back now and says, yeah, that was pretty racist. And black and Irish people in particular, and Asian, South Asian people were really getting a hiding from the police on a regular basis, and there was a legitimate rage there. The 1985 riots, both in Tottenham and in Brixton, the ones in Brixton were set off by the police shooting and paralysing a woman called Sherry Gross. The ones in Tottenham by the death after a police raid on her home of a woman called Cynthia Jarrett. So it's interesting that at the time, many people on the quote-unquote left described that as barbarous acts of criminality and symptoms of the absence of any viable tradition of ethnic politics. The choice of the word ethnic is very, very interesting. And again, anyone who spent time in Caribbean or Asian communities, gone to New Beacon Bookstore, read C.L.R. James or Walter Rodney or Eric Williams or Arundhati Roy or Sivanandan or any of these great thinkers would just find that the assertion that there is that quote-unquote ethnic communities in this country have no tradition of viable politics. Very, very interesting, you know. I don't know. Again, it just reveals a really interesting lack of knowledge even of the British Commonwealth. So, for example, in the Caribbean in the late 1930s, there were massive labour uprisings against British rule, 1938 in particular, in which scores of Caribbeans were shot dead. Jamaica became the third country in the entire British Commonwealth to have universal adult suffrage, partly as a result of these uprisings in the late 1930s. after Britain itself and New Zealand. So this idea that there was no viable ethnic politics is very, very interesting again. And the history of rioting in Britain, much worse riots than the ones in the 80s, such as the Gordon riots and others, throughout working class British history, is very well recorded. You know, when people are frustrated and they finally lose their rag, they rise up, and it's not always coherent, not always well planned. But the idea that it represents an absence of politics is very interesting, because no one on the left says that about the riots of the working class communities, white working class communities, prior to the arrival of Caribbean and Asian settlers. So it's interesting that these ethnic riots represent the absence of politics, but the Gordon riots and others before obviously don't represent an absence of politics. They were legitimate political grievances. Anyway, I won't go on. I will read you, the final, on the very final page, it says something that I think is really interesting. He says, race must be retained as an analytic category, not because it corresponds to any biological or epistemological, them words there, absolutes, but because it refers, investigation to the power that collective identity acquires by means of their roots in tradition. These identities, in the forms of white racism and black resistance, are the most volatile political forces in Britain today. And I think in many ways that would ring as true today, that race, despite what people want to think, is very little to do with biology. In Britain, I am a black person. In America, I am a black person. In the Caribbean, when I go back, I am high colour. In Australia, as I've pointed out in my book, I go to Australia and I'm a privileged, educated, relatively well-off Western foreigner. And Aboriginal brothers and sisters, Indigenous brothers and sisters, who in many cases have lighter skin than me because of the history of the stolen generation, are what they call out their blackfellas, and definitely would be subject to worse treatment than me as a privileged foreigner, even though they have lighter skin than I do. So what Gilroy is talking about in many ways is correct. Whilst racists have always tried to biologize race, they've always been willing to push the boundary of where that biology, where the biological boundaries sit, depending on the political needs of the time. And Britain is an example of that. You look at the relationship, say, between black and Irish people in Britain between the 60s and the 80s. Very, very close relationships, even though the Irish apparently are white. Because they were not really, seen as deserving of the treatment of people racialized as white in post-war Britain. They were treated in really, really bad ways. It was stereotyping of them, police brutality towards the Irish. Then you contrast that with the way the Irish and black relations are in America, very, very different. Because the Irish were offered the carrots of whiteness and co-opted into American white supremacy, there was no... And of course in Britain, a place like Toxteth or Tottenham or Brixton, where Irish neighbourhoods, Caribbeans were dumped in those neighbourhoods, and the relations between Irish and Caribbean community became quite close. In America, segregation meant no such collaboration could occur. So what Gilroy really looks at is obviously a very Marxist critique, but a critique of race-class politics in post-war Britain. Definitely a classic book, part of the canon. This week's great read is There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack by Paul Gilroy.
So read, stuck on the block, read, sitting in the box, read.